We're going to transition a little bit from the alpine environments down to the Modoc Plateau. Our next speaker is Kyle Merriam. Kyle has been working as an ecologist since 1997, including positions with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the U.S. Geological Survey, and the U.S. Forest Service. She has worked for the Sierra Cascade Ecology Program serving Modoc, Lassen, and the Plumas National Forests since 2005. As part of the Regional Ecology Program, her focus is on providing best available ecological science to inform natural resource management. And her recent projects include climate change adaptation and data interpretation, post-fire restoration efforts, and conservation of rare conifers threatened by altered fire regimes. And this morning, she's going to talk to us about climate change and vernal pools on the Modoc Plateau. Welcome, Kyle.
Thanks, Russ. And yeah, thank you so much for having me here today. It's really great to be here and see so many familiar faces. I realized I have been working for the Forest Service for over 20 years because I recognize so many people here. So it's just really nice to be here today. And yeah, I'm going to talk about some work that we did looking at climate change and vernal pools on the Modoc Plateau. This was work that was done by Ashton Montrone as part of his master's thesis at the University of Nevada, Reno. And it was done in collaboration with the U.S. Forest Service, myself, the Nature Conservancy, and the Desert Research Institute. Okay, so I probably don't have to explain to all of you here that vernal pools are really defined by this specific hydrology. But I will anyway, because it's part of my talk. So vernal pools fill during the winter or spring seasons with rain, and in the case of the Modoc Plateau, they fill primarily with snow. Then they have this kind of slow drying down period in the spring, and then they're completely dry during the summer. So this is really a tough environment, and not many species are adapted to survive both total inundation as well as complete desiccation. And as a result, we have these really specialized communities of plants and animals that are able to survive in these really highly fluctuating conditions. And just these really special and diverse vernal pool plant and animal communities, I think, are what we all really appreciate about vernal pools, and they also support a number of rare and endemic species. And these plant and animal communities are really tied to the length of the inundation period. So in this slide, you can see that the plant species that require shorter inundation periods are kind of the first to bloom and emerge as the vernal pool is drying down. So you can see on the outside ring, we have kind of one set of species that are adapted to shorter inundation periods. And then as we get closer towards the center of the pool, we have other species that require longer inundation periods. And a number of classification schemes for vernal pool plant communities are really tied to the length of inundation. So you can kind of classify plant communities or vernal pools according to the inundation tolerance of the species. So we did this classification on the Modoc Plateau, really looking at how species were organized in vernal pools, and on the Modoc Plateau as well, they're really tightly linked to the length of inundation. So we identified indicator species for the short inundated community. These were the species that had the lowest tolerance for being inundated. And this short inundated community is really characterized by some upland species and even some non-native species such as Bromus hordeaceus. Then we have our medium inundated community. These are species that can tolerate inundation but sort of have a limit as to how much they can withstand. And these are some of our more facultative wetland species. We start to see a few vernal pool specialists, but we have kind of more of a range of also kind of facultative wetland species in this group. And then finally, our long inundated community is where we really start to see our vernal pool specialists and our vernal pool endemics. These are where a lot of our species diversity is in vernal pools, and also many of our rare species occur in this long inundated group, such as this Xylocarpus, one of my favorite cute little popcorn flower. Okay, threats to vernal pools. I'm sure all of you have seen this before, but we know that vernal pools have been extensively lost throughout California, primarily as a result of agricultural conversion, as well as development, housing, and industrial development. However, there are a number of vernal pools that occur on federal lands, and this is primarily on the Modoc Plateau you see in the northeast corner of the state. And so we've always felt that the vernal pools that occur without the threat of agricultural conversion or development are some of the most protected pools in the state. However, as we've seen changes in patterns of precipitation and temperature associated with climate change, we've begun to realize that even pools that aren't directly threatened by direct impacts may be threatened by some of these longer term changes. Okay, so our question was, how will climate change affect vernal pools? And to answer this question, we first developed a model of the hydrology of vernal pools, so a water balance model. And you'll see we kind of have this diagram of how vernal pool hydrology works. We have this impervious durapan layer, which is really what defines a vernal pool. So that's what allows water to accumulate and create a vernal pool. And so we started by kind of identifying the inputs into vernal pools, which include rain, and especially on the Modoc Plateau, snow melt is an important input to the vernal pool water balance model. Then we have losses from the vernal pool, right? So we have absorption of water into the soil. We have loss from actual evapotranspiration, which is a really important component of loss, as well as seepage. And you can see that there's some soil that kind of lays on top of the durapan, and this is sort of in equilibrium with the pool when we think about what causes a pool to fill and what factors kind of influence vernal pool hydrology. So first we developed this water balance model. And you can see that's in the middle with the circle around it. Developing that was really the primary component to developing our overall modeling approach to ask how climate change might affect vernal pool hydrology. So using the water balance model, we could then ask how changes in temperature and precipitation, which we were able to infer from both PRISM and climate model data, might influence both the hydro period, so the length of time the vernal pool is inundated, as well as the depth of the vernal pool. And then we were able to tie those predicted changes both in inundation length and water depth with the vegetation modeling that I showed you in an earlier slide. And this was work that Meredith Goshen and I did in 2017, really developing a classification for vernal pool plant species on the Modoc Plateau and tying that directly to vernal pool hydrology. So we could look at how changes in vernal pool hydrology then affected changes in our vegetation community. Okay, so we developed this model based on field data that we collected at Coyote Springs Vernal Pool. This is a pool on the Lassen National Forest, and very typical of vernal pools on the Modoc Plateau. This is a high elevation vernal pool, so above 5,000 feet elevation, which means that one of the primary inputs of water to the pool is from snow. This is a large vernal pool, which is also typical of the Modoc, over 11 acres, and it's in a matrix of a coniferous forest. So, somewhat different from the vernal pools that we find elsewhere in the state. But we also have very extensive plant community data from this pool. You can see from all those red dots. So we had representatives of communities that required the whole range of inundation periods that we found in the pool, including edge species, the more shallow tolerant species, as well as our long-term inundated community. And that included one of our federally listed species that we've been monitoring on the Modoc Plateau, which is Orchidia tenuis, or slender orchid grass. All right, so to calibrate our water balance model for Coyote Springs Vernal Pool, we used stage gauges that we placed in the pool, and then we left them in the pool for an entire year. And during that year, we had wildlife cameras that took pictures every 4 hours. So every 4 hours for an entire year, we could look at the photo and see the depth of the vernal pool. So we had a lot of data. Luckily, this was Ashton's master, so I didn't have to analyze this myself. So how did our model do? You can see in this graph, we have the observed data based on the stage gauges in the dark circles, and then compared with our modeled data, which is the hollow triangles. And so we were able to use the observed data to really calibrate our model, including estimating how much water was being stored in the soil, developing coefficients for actual evapotranspiration, calibrating the temperature of the rain and the snow, and the amount of both of those things, as well as the seepage loss factor, how much water is being lost from the system, and then a couple soil calibrations as well. And so we used this data to develop these parameter values, and we were able to develop a model that was very close to our observed data. So we had an R-squared of 0.96, and so we felt like we had a really good model that could very closely predict both the depth of the inundation as well as length of inundation of our vernal pool. Okay, now we have this great model. What are we going to do with it? Let's project into the future. So in order to ask how climate change might affect vernal pools, we took our model and applied 18 downscaled global climate models under 2 different emissions scenarios. So we averaged these 18 models and then looked at 2 different emission scenarios. We applied some corrections from PRISM data based on the calibration from our water balance model. And then we could link our hydrologic model to the vegetation model, and we did this for 2 time periods. We looked at a historic period of 1990 to 1999. Oh my gosh, I have 3 minutes. Okay, sorry. And then we looked at the future, 2090 to 2099, and then calculated the difference between these 2 10-year intervals. All right, so what did we find? You guys ready? Da, 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 da. Okay, inundation length significantly declined for our future scenarios under both emission scenarios. We have A2 and B1 are the 2 different emission scenarios, and we saw a significant reduction in the length of time that the vernal pool is inundated. On the other hand, we really didn't see any difference in the depth of the vernal pool for our future predictions. Now, how does this relate to the plant community? Well, we found that for the edge community, the percent of the pool that would be inundated for short time periods significantly increased. The shallow tolerant community, so sort of those medium inundation periods, also increased. And our long-term inundated community had a much smaller percentage of the pool where they would have suitable habitat conditions. Sorry, did you guys think this was going to be good news? Given a climate change talk's a bit of a downer, but so basically, I always find it so interesting when we look at climate change that we have really very little change in precipitation that we're seeing both currently and in predicted future models. So, and I think this was the main reason that we didn't see any change in the depth of the vernal pools. However, higher temperatures, both that we're observing now and that are predicted into the future, are really what's driving this drying down of vernal pools. So we have greater actual evapotranspiration, and we have greater percentage of our precipitation following as rain versus snow, which means it's much less persistent on the landscape. Rain tends to run off, whereas snow forms this kind of long-term storage and slowly fills these vernal pools. So it's really temperature that's driving this, and we're seeing this in so many of our vegetation types right now, where even though precipitation is relatively similar over time, although it's more variable, increased temperatures are causing many of our systems to be drier. Okay, and unfortunately this reduction in hydroperiod could really reduce the amount of habitat for our vernal pool specialist species, which are our species that we tend to be most concerned about. All right, what can we do? Well, on the Modoc Plateau, for example, you'll see in the lower right-hand picture, there's been quite a lot of hydrologic alteration. So there's definitely opportunity to restore hydrology. We've also found that grazing can lengthen inundation periods by removing that thatch layer. So appropriate grazing can also help to perhaps mitigate some of these changes. Also, I think monitoring is always important, something that we should continue to do, and then really recognize that our long inundated communities may be most vulnerable, and really try to give them extra attention. So, okay, thank you, and it's time for questions.
Can you go back to the slide where you had the inundation lengths and the list of species?
Can you, oh, okay, good. Yes, let's do that. Let's go back.
Yes.
This one? Okay.
Are those the species that are restricted to your categories? Because you kept showing pictures of Downingias, and you don't have a Downingia on there.
Well, so these are the indicators of this group. These are the ones that are the most strongly related to those inundation lengths. We do have a lot of other species that can kind of surf between groups, so they may have wider ranges of inundation tolerances. These are the indicators for those groups. Does that make sense?
Thank you. That's what I wanted to know.
You're welcome. Well, we don't have Downingia. I just put it in there because it's beautiful. I'm just kidding. There is Downingia. Yeah. Hi.
So over your career at Plumas and Lassen and Modoc, have you seen any effects of the wildfires affecting the vernal pool communities that you've been studying?
I mean, unfortunately, one of the biggest effects we've seen is from fire suppression. We do unfortunately often have suppression during wildfire emergencies, bulldozers and things like that, using vernal pools to create like safety zones or containment lines. Luckily our pools, since they're often completely dry during the wildfire season, if we do get a fire during that time, it doesn't necessarily directly affect most of our specialist species, and we often do even get some positive effects, similar to grazing, of removing a lot of that thatch or some of our non-native species. So direct fire effects aren't necessarily a great concern to us for our vernal pools, but fire suppression tactics have resulted in some damage to our vernal pools, unfortunately.
Thank you.
Would thinning the conifer forest around these is that a feasible way to increase water into the vernal pools?
Since these pools are really defined by that durapan layer, we really don't have that same kind of problem that we see in some of our meadows where we have encroachment from like conifer, upland conifer species. And the hydrology of the vernal pool is really directly related to precip. It doesn't have as much of a, I think with some of our meadow systems, we have more interaction between kind of the upland surrounding the meadow and the meadow itself. The vernal pools are really just these little perched basins, right? So they're not relying on, they're just getting precip or snow to fill. So that's not as much of a, I think, a tactic that we could use, but we do have definitely a lot of options for restoring hydrology. There's been quite a bit of like ditching and just, you know, there's a lot of ways like road construction, things like that, that have directly affected our vernal pools where I think that we could take some management action. One question only. Better be good. No questions? Sorry, didn't mean to intimidate you.
Hi, Kyle. Great talk. My question for you is, given the results of this study, what are your management implications for slender orchid grass and conservation of that species?
Yeah, I don't know where I'm looking, but yeah, I think really I've done a lot of work with grazing management, and I feel like that is something that we really could continue to work on. I mean, we've definitely found negative effects of grazing on slender orchid grass. These pools can be grazed when they're still wet or drying down, and when we get a lot of hoof punching into these wet soils, we've seen that have negative effects on slender orchid grass. So I think that really appropriate grazing management is something that could really benefit our pools, particularly in a warmer, drier future. Okay, stop. Thank you so much.